My name is Amal. That is mean hope. But I don't find any hope, unfortunately.
Amal Al-Hassan is a journalist from Sudan who fled to Kenya last year after war broke out in her country.
Every Sudanese woman, child, a man facing very hard time. This war is like a nightmare. We are all suffering a lot. We are lost.
Sudan is about to mark a sad anniversary, 1 year of war with no end in sight.
Right now with Sudan, things are really quite dark. The nation is divided. The mistrust between the two actors and also across the country runs so deep.
Sudan is in the grip of a humanitarian disaster. The UN believes the country is experiencing the world's largest internal displacement crisis. There are fears that if not stopped, this conflict could further destabilize an already volatile region. In this episode, we try to piece together the Sudan picture from the few trusted sources that are left on the ground, with the help of our Africa watchers who we met in Nairobi. And the warning, there are distressing details. I'm Krassi Twig, and this is The Global Jigsaw, an original podcast from BBC Monitoring, zooming in on political, security and social shifts around the world through the lens of its media. Our team listens to, watches and analyzes media narratives in 100 languages.
Radio Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두당 두 나라 최고 영도자 동지들께서는
Sudan remains important despite the fact that it's become the war that's sort of been in the back burner because there's so many other things going on. Now there's a war in Gaza. There's still the conflict in Ukraine.
Beverly Ochieng, one of our top Africa experts, was telling me why the world should be paying attention to this conflict.
There's a bigger Middle East crisis, and Sudan straddles that region. It's an African country, but it also has very strong Muslim-Arab links. So it's still caught in the crossfire of all of that. There was concerns about the possibility of Sudan further fracturing.
A further fracturing in a high-stakes region might have far-reaching consequences, but more on those later. This is a complex story. So let's get the basics. What's happening and who is fighting whom? Here's another Africa watcher, Ahmed Mohamed Abdi.
The war that broke out between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces, two very well-armed parties, has created a huge humanitarian situation in the country and also displacement at unprecedented levels. So this one is more complex, bigger in terms of the spread of the conflict because it has affected the whole of the country.
Here's what this means in numbers. 18 million people face acute hunger, according to the World Food Programme. The UN says 8 million people are internally displaced or have fled the country. The war in Sudan is a multi-layered conflict, so before we can start unpicking it, we need to know a bit of the history with the help of Decca Barrow from our Nairobi team and this fact file.
Sudan is the third largest country in Africa, stretching across an unstable and geopolitically vital region. It's predominantly Muslim and with 46 million people, one of the poorest countries in the world. It straddles the Nile River and borders 7 countries, each with security challenges that are intertwined with the politics of Khartoum. Sudan has lucrative minerals, including gold, uranium, and iron ore. It has been in and out of civil wars since it gained independence in 1956. Its western region of Darfur saw successive wars from 2003. Another protracted war led to its splitting into 2 countries in 2011 after oil-rich southern Sudan voted for independence. This followed decades of struggle by the mainly Christian and animist South against rule by the Arab Muslim North. Sudan has also had successive coups entrenching military regimes that favored Islamic-oriented governments. Another turning point came in 2018 when nationwide protests broke out demanding the removal of one of Africa's longest-serving leaders, Omar al-Bashir. He came to power in an Islamist-backed coup in 1989 and was the first ever sitting president to be indicted on genocide charges by the International Criminal Court. Women played a prominent role in the revolution. Following Bashir's ousting, a sovereign council consisting of military and civilian leaders meant to prepare Sudan for a return to civilian rule and elections, but that was hijacked by another coup. Since then, Sudan has been torn between two military men trying to share power, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, head of the army, and General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, leader of the Rapid Support Forces, formerly based in Darfur, and known as Janjaweed militias. Their dispute led to an outright war that started last April.
Let's go back to 2018, a key moment for people power, which resulted in the removal of a long-serving strongman.
In January 2018, we were talking about protests and disgruntlement because of the rising cost of bread, which is a basic commodity for many. And then within the span of a year, how those protests morphed into calls to remove one of the longest serving leaders in the region. And how the state of the economy had been so shattered under Omar al-Bashir because there had been Western sanctions because of the allegations that they were sponsoring the Al-Qaeda group. There was a period in the 90s where it was discovered that Osama bin Laden, the then leader, had been hiding out in Sudan. But there was also the wave of change that was coming from young people who were exposed. The media had opened up at this point. There were lots of newspapers, lots of online pages who were mobilizing online by these so-called neighborhood resistance committees, by even just young activists and artists. There were people who were chanting, Sudan is ours. And then eventually those chants changed into Omar Bashir must leave.
The ousting of one of Africa's longest-serving autocrats sent waves of excitement and optimism around the region that the voice of the people could become a real factor in Sudan's politics. But it wasn't the people who reaped the rewards. It was two men with appetite for power. It started as a revolution and it ended in a coup.
Before the war broke out, there had been some discussions for the possible formation of another government, which would include some of the civilian and political actors who had been part of that transition. The former Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok, who had been removed, and there was still the military leader, Burhan, and then there was the leader of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, Hemeti. And there were discussions where the RSF would need to be dissolved. And Hemeti wasn't too happy with the possibility that he might lose his own center of power. And because of these two centers of power constantly antagonizing each other, a war broke out.
Was their disagreement always about who's going to be number one?
Essentially, yes. Hemeti seemed to be building himself to be a bit of a statesman, and sometimes it felt as if he would be overshadowing Burhan. Burhan is from an old guard, so he's not doing social media videos and he's not doing, your very slick campaigns online or showing up in suits and places. Hemeti was really reaching out to the civilian coalition, the Forces for Freedom and Change. He was building a whole campaign around himself. He was traveling to different places. And this was sort of giving him a bit of a mark. And there was the discussion that there was the possibility they could hand over Bashir to the ICC, which may have implicated the two men. So in a way, they had to find a way to outmaneuver each other, it seems.
Two men with their eyes set on the top job, each one fearful of the looming threat of justice, each one with a lot to lose. The result is a country caught in their power struggle, not what the people behind the revolution were hoping for.
The military removed the most powerful man, but I think that wave of euphoria has been shattered, particularly now because of the war. And because many of those groups that had been galvanizing this pro-democracy movement, where you have young people and women at the center of politics, they're now either escaped because of the war, or their voices cannot really be heard in, you have gunfire, literally, almost every day.
One of those seeking shelter from the shooting in the first weeks of the conflict last April in Omdurman was journalist Amal Al-Hassan and her small team of the El Tahrir website. She watched the war descending on her country.
We're facing a very horrible time, and at the same time we keep working because we tell each other, and this is our job. When the war starts, the first victim is the truth. And there is like a big propaganda from the both sides of conflict parties. That is why we have to continue speaking about what happened to the people and the violence that Sudanese people are facing, and how is Khartoum it became like a city of ghosts in no time. Sudanese people suffering a lot.
U.S. Special Operations Forces executing a dangerous and daring mission.
Embassies
to evacuate
vacated
the
their
American
staff,
embassy
in
the
some instances
capital of
destroyed
Sudan.
documents because of safety.
More than 100 special ops forces, including the Navy's elite SEAL team.
There was some anger towards Western states because the Sudan war was also taking place the same time as the war in Ukraine. And there were some visa arrangements for Ukrainian nationals leaving the country. And people were calling out Western governments for not making similar arrangements for Sudanese nationals, even those who had families away.
The capital, Khartoum, hadn't seen war in decades until last April. People left in their hundreds of thousands, including many journalists like Amal. That created an information vacuum, which was quickly filled with rumors and propaganda. So how do you monitor a country at war, where your reliable sources vanish almost overnight? Moses Rono, a veteran of monitoring Africa's media, explains his team's challenges.
The media generally, or over the years, was repressed under Bashir. Journalists used to struggle to get access to information. I remember a long time ago when I started, we used to have what used to be called pre-press censorship. So government agents would confiscate complete print runs of newspapers just before they are made available in the newsstands, and you'd get blank pages of newspapers. There was the hope after the revolution that the tight controls that Bashir had imposed on the press and the media generally in Sudan were going to go away, and the media would be more robust. But with the war starting, we've had massive challenges. As a team monitoring Sudan, the biggest challenge is getting reliable information from the country. All the actors are fighting to control the message. If you look at the state TV, radio, Omdurman, and Sunna, the official news agency, all controlled by the army, and they skew the reporting towards the army line. At the same time, outlets that are pro the RSF would skew the reporting to favor them. So that's been a challenge because finding reliable information is really difficult. A number of media sources, including websites, even radios, are no longer accessible. Some of the reliable websites, they will take weeks and weeks before they update. It's quite sporadic and unreliable. It is very unsafe. We couldn't get freelancers, we couldn't get access to some of the newspapers, we couldn't get access to radio stations. That's a big challenge that we face.
Amal Al-Hassan, the Sudanese editor of El Tahir website, has an on-the-ground perspective on why reliable information has become hard to get.
I'm responsible from my team. All the time I told them there is no story valuable more than your life. I wanted them to stay safe. At the same time, I know that mission they are doing, it is not easy. They are in very dangerous places. They could lose their life, and no one is going to ask what happened. So they are really very brave. They are still working every single day. Even they have like very problems, like there is no power for days, and there is a problem of accessing the internet. But when the internet is come, they bring their stories immediately. One day he write a story about something happened before 3 days. I said, nobody know about this, don't worry. We can't call it a news in our evaluation of what news is, something happened now. But it is still news, and you are doing a great job.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. So the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces are the main parties in this war. Bev will talk about the RSF and Ahmed will describe the army for you. Let's go through the main elements. First, who are the warring parties?
The Sudan Armed Forces has ruled this country for almost 57 years out of the nearly 70 years of this country's independence. Just before the war broke out, I think the Sudan Armed Forces was one of the most powerful in the Horn of Africa region, with over 200,000 troops. This is just a modern army which has an air force, which has a naval troops, which has also ground troops. They were well equipped, although most of their equipment came from Russia and China because of the sanctions placed on the country.
The RSF was born out of a militia known as the Janjaweed, which had been operating in the Darfur region, formed by Arab ethnic groups. And they were countering rebel groups that had emerged in the Darfur region. You know, Darfur, the place of the four. And the war was an issue around skin color and identity. And the rebel groups, who were largely from the Masalit and the four black communities, when they had essentially been defeated, the Janjaweed was formalized into a force that would be a sort of paramilitary coalition, but also would be used for insurgencies outside of Sudan, because that was lucrative, especially for Hemeti, who was building himself as a sort of kingmaker of the region.
The Rapid Support Forces are estimated to have numbered about 100,000 before the war started. That's half the size of the Sudanese army. And the two men vying for the top job, Burhan and Hemeti, have a long shared history.
Al-Burhan is a career soldier. He joined the military college in Khartoum before also taking military courses in Egypt and Jordan. He's also been the military attaché of Sudan in China in April 2019. He was installed as the chairman of the Transitional Military Council just a day after al-Bashir was toppled by his defense minister and senior military generals, including al-Burhan.
General Burhan, he had been a long-time ally of Omar al-Bashir, so he is pretty much of the old regime. He has lots of military economic interests. And then his deputy, up until, the war broke out, was Hemeti, Hamdan Dagalo Hemeti. And he is the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. There's all this contention about Hemeti's citizenship. He's believed to be Chadian, possibly. He comes from Darfur. And he had been the leader of the RSF since the early 2000s. He had been a camel herder, someone who has really risen up from almost nothing to being in the position that he is. And I suppose when the coup happened in 2019, it did give Hemeti the possibility of having a bigger political ambition. He could actually be a statesman.
Sudan consists of 18 states. So who's in control of which part of the country?
The Sudan Armed Forces controls most parts of the country. As of now, most of the states, especially those in the north, central and eastern parts, most of the Sudan Armed Forces capabilities and bases are still intact.
When the war broke out, it almost felt as if the RSF had the upper hand because they did manage to take quite a few military bases in very strategic areas. Over a long time, the RSF has had de facto control over the western region of Darfur, and that's because of their involvement in the 2003 genocide. If you're in the Darfur corridor, you're very close to Chad and even the Central African Republic. If you were towards the Kordofans, you were near South Sudan. That's also a very big trafficking route.
The UN estimates that 300,000 people were killed in the Darfur war, and Omar al-Bashir is still being sought by the International Criminal Court on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity over that conflict. We heard that propaganda replaced reliable information. So what's the message you hear from the warring sides? Let's start with the army, their narrative, and how they respond to accusations of abuses.
The Sudan Armed Forces interpret the current conflict in the sense that this is a rebellion by Rapid Support Forces against the state, and that they are trying to defeat this rebellion, which they accuse of destroying the country and also committing atrocities against civilians in the areas that they seized. There have been accusations against the army of carrying out indiscriminate airstrikes against civilian populated areas, especially inside the capital Khartoum and also some cities in Darfur and Kordofan regions, but the army has repeatedly denied this. The army also points to the fact that the areas that are under the control of the armed forces is where most of the civilians have fled to. They're basically saying that this shows that the civilians have faith in the armed forces. They acknowledge that there have been some civilian casualties in some of their airstrikes and also some of their attacks, but they're saying that these are limited and not intentional. They always compare that to what they call the indiscriminate and deliberate attacks by the RSF. There have been reports by human rights organizations and the United Nations that the RSF committed atrocities. In the West Darfur state, the RSF killed between 10 to 15,000 civilians. The army is basically pointing to these reports.
To contrast these reports, the RSF are portraying themselves as the good guys against multiple accusations of war crimes, which they deny.
Sometimes they'll put out material trying to demonstrate that they are sharing humanitarian aid, even though the accounts from the media and activists are very different from that. What you see on their social media feed is that they are willing to change Sudan and they want to be part of the politics, but the narratives coming out are very different. And one of the things that they do primarily is the othering. They would talk about the Islamist influence in the government, and that obviously linked back to Omar al-Bashir and his links with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They would talk about the possibility of jihadists, and that would also echo with the fact that Osama bin Laden had once been hosted in the country, and that's what led to sanctions. And in doing so, they were trying to adapt the language of the more revolutionary political and social class who had wanted Omar al-Bashir out.
The RSF seem to be refashioning some of the revolutionary language in a quest for appeal, and they seem to have a sophisticated social media strategy.
They're really good with media. Part of it is believed to be domiciled in the UAE. They had Facebook accounts, which were taken down. They do have a raft of Twitter accounts, including influencers. They have their official accounts where they will put out long statements. They put out videos of organizing football tournaments between children. And by contrast, Sudanese media and activists who could report on the conflict talked about how the RSF was allegedly rounding up young men and sometimes just executing them on sight. Whenever allegations of war crimes emerge, the US has cited this, the UN has cited this, the ICC prosecutors cited this.
We are collecting a very significant body of material, information and evidence that is relevant to those particular crimes.
The RSF tends to be disproportionately mentioned a lot more in these reports.
How the army spreads its message couldn't be more different.
Sudan TV airs military statements and videos that promote military propaganda. Most of these bulletins, they lead with the Sudanese armed forces statements or battlefield victories. And also reports from the army commander, General Burhan. The army also uses social media, just like the RSF. Its account on Facebook has over 2 million followers, and it uses that platform to share statements and videos. It also has an account on social media platform X.
Claims of battlefield victories fighting it out on the information front. And if the story wasn't complex enough, wait until you hear about the web of external forces with a vested interest, and it's a long list.
Egypt was one of the countries that also was backing the new administration in Sudan after Bashir was toppled. It also supported the Sudanese transitional government and is currently accused of also backing the Sudanese armed forces. Russia and China, they have supported al-Bashir. And after the fall of Bashir, they maintained relations with the Transitional Council led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. They still maintain relations with the current military-led government. China had in the past a huge interest in Sudan's energy sector. The same goes for Russia, although it has mainly military cooperation with Sudan. There have been reports of Russian companies in the mining sector in Sudan, especially in the gold mining in Darfur and the northern and eastern regions of the country. The Russian government officially says that it is neutral in this conflict and has called for dialogue between the two parties. And there was this military cooperation agreement that dates back to the government of Omar al-Bashir that Russia will establish a naval base in Port Sudan, which is on the Red Sea. The military said that they were reviewing that agreement that was reached with the Russians.
The RSF has a lot of bases in Darfur. They were sort of de facto running the gold mine. They were also linked to the Wagner mercenaries from Russia, and Hemeti did have his own training and support agreement with the Wagner group. The army has said that the RSF is possibly getting reinforcements from the Wagner group either from Libya or from the CAR, or even somehow getting in through Chad, because that border area is quite volatile. There's also been allegations that South Sudan may have militarily facilitated the RSF. South Sudan has officially denied this.
It sounds a bit like a two circles Venn diagram with Russia in the middle, and that is just one actor. Let's take a closer look at the regional actors with a stake in this war. Our guide is Sumaya Baksh from our Middle East team.
The key Arab actors in the Sudan conflict are the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. In terms of what their game is in Sudan, they have divergent interests. So, for example, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are both seeking to increase their influence regionally. And so we've seen this play out in the Sudan conflict, which also has translated to rivalry between the two Gulf states, which we've also seen, for example, in Yemen.
Yemen too has had its own conflict for a decade now that has brought disaster to its people. It's curious to find a connection between Sudan and Yemen.
The Saudi-led coalition began its military campaign in Yemen against the Houthi rebels in 2015, and Sudan sent tens of thousands of troops to fight in Yemen on the side of the government backed by the coalition. Thousands have been killed during that time, but we don't have clear figures on that apart from the Houthi sources.
سجلت الأشهر الماضية خسائر في صفوف المرتزقة السودانيين.
The Houthis are currently in the spotlight for attacking ships in the Red Sea, and keeping that shipping lane safe is important for the Gulf states, among others.
Any further instability or any broadening of the scope of any conflict in the region could further impact the situation in the Red Sea, shipping interests, investment for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and it's not in their interest to see any kind of further instability or threats to security in the region.
Saudi Arabia and the UAE are supporting the opposing sides in the Sudan conflict. What's this competition about?
For Saudi Arabia, these talks have been really important in terms of really increasing its global influence and how it's viewed as an important regional player. There is a rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the UAE in terms of both of them. All of the Gulf states are seeking to diversify their economies away from oil and to increase their political influence in the region and also on a global level. And in Sudan specifically, Saudi Arabia backs the army, and the UAE has reportedly got links to the RSF. We've seen reports of it providing arms to the RSF. A recent UN report that said it found credible evidence that it has been providing weapons. This has been denied by the UAE, but this is what we've seen.
Another significant player that Ahmed mentioned earlier has more at stake because of its geographical proximity.
Egypt is Sudan's neighbour, so firstly in terms of security there's the potential threat at its border of armed groups and spillover, but additionally it hosts Sudanese refugees, and at the moment it's hosting more than 300,000 refugees, and the longer this goes on the more potential there is for more refugees to arrive in the country, and that could potentially cause further strain on its already struggling economy.
International efforts to bring peace, or at least a ceasefire, have failed to deliver. Getting the warring parties to the table doesn't seem an easy task. Bev guides us through the attempts.
The biggest one comes from the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is known as IGAD. It's the Horn of Africa bloc, and it spans a huge area. So Sudan, you have South Sudan, you have Kenya, you have Uganda, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti. They were among the first to call for a ceasefire. Kenya has always had this peacemaking role in the region. They facilitated the eventual fracture between Sudan and South Sudan in a way that didn't end up being as acrimonious as we saw the civil war being. They have played a key role in peace processes in Ethiopia. President William Ruto said, "We asked these generals to stop the nonsense," and that didn't go down very well.
We have no capacity to stop this nonsense in our own continent because our own peace and security fund is funded by others. We have a problem.
It felt like a strong message to stop the war, but in the end, it has severely degraded the progress of peace talks. So IGAD has not been able to play a very influential role as it would in bringing the two parties together. Ethiopia has also tried, not just by hosting refugees, but also trying to demonstrate that its own peace process from the civil war could be used as a template for a possible peace process. That hasn't worked. But what has happened now is that the army has said it is no longer part of IGAD. And Hemeti said, he does not recognize that. They still believe in the IGAD effort. Then you obviously have the African Union. It did form a mechanism which will be led by 3 people who will be overseeing talks. But then for the very first time when talks resumed in Jeddah towards the end of last year, IGAD and the African Union did join that process. You would imagine it would have given it more weight, but so far there's still no ceasefire.
I have a more pessimistic view about where we are in terms of the peace talks or attempts to end the war. The biggest players have been Saudi Arabia, supported by the US. They've been leading what has been called the Jeddah track or dialogue.
Moses' assessment about the Jeddah talks is somewhat downbeat too. And there's an elephant in the room, someone with a big footprint on the continent whose presence hasn't been felt.
What has happened is the US's own, I feel, waning diplomatic weight. The US has tried to bring its voice, tried to, applying sanctions, backing talks, but it's not adequate in terms of the response, in terms of even getting some sort of actionability. The two generals do not feel compelled to respect what the US is calling for, and that says a lot about its own power and its own weight.
I think there's been unwillingness by the two parties, that is the army and the RSF, to agree on a ceasefire or a settlement to the conflict because, one, the RSF believes that it's about to win the war. The second thing is the army has demanded that before any progress is made or an agreement is reached, the RSF should be pushed back. The army also cannot agree to a ceasefire that allows the RSF sweeping powers or control of many parts of the country.
So no talks yet, and even talks about talks feel like a distant perspective. Getting everyone in the same room would be an achievement in itself. Our Sudanese journalist Amal Al-Hassan says there's an important omission from the list of participants: the journalists themselves, the people with the best understanding of the situation on the ground.
The journalists didn't get involved in the peace negotiation and the ceasefire, and this is not good. We have to be there, we have to participate and be a witness for what is happening, really, because everyone shares the part of the story from his point of view. No one tells the truth. As a Sudanese journalist, we are all facing a problem in getting information. The army side, they just wanted to put their statements in their official page, and we just have to take that. I sent them a message to the spokesman of the staff several times. I sent him a message, he never responded. Also the RSF, he has people responsible from the media. When you ask them, they never answer your questions. Both sides are hating us. They don't like journalists. I don't think we feel secure inside Sudan. Too many of our colleagues get killed or kidnapped or arrested. And if you are a journalist and woman, this is a very bad situation because women are targeted also by sexual violence and by attacking her or family. So the situation of journalists is very bad in this war. So that is why I decided to save myself and my family. I'm a single mom and I have 2 kids.
What Amel describes is the near impossible task of bringing the unimaginable suffering in Sudan to the attention of the world. And there are fears that no resolution could lead to a deepening of the conflict. Moses has a few thoughts about the future.
There have been reports of communities mobilizing to protect communities, and that is also adding to the angst and the worry about Sudan. There is a possibility of a protracted conflict in the country, in a situation where the army and the RSF are in a deadlock. The collapse of the army is another possibility. The next scenario is the RSF taking control of the country. The third thing is about the success of the peace talks. If the Saudi and the IGAD, the disjointed peace initiatives, are brought together and the influential players are asked to help push for a peace agreement, that seems like a possibility that many people are keen on and think that could work. The other scenario, which is the army wins. There have been reports that the army could be considering mobilizing militias and other fighters in its fight against the RSF.
Bev said at the start that Sudan is important. Moses spells out why, in addition to it being currently the largest humanitarian crisis, Sudan matters globally.
Sudan sits in a very critical geostrategic location. It's a gateway to Horn of Africa, and it's also the gateway to Central and the Sahel. If you look at the countries that neighbor Sudan, there are a number of unstable countries. So South Sudan, dealing with its own civil war. CAR, which has had long-running sectarian war. You've got Libya and the divisions there. Ethiopia, which is recovering from the recent conflicts. And a very important country, Chad. Chad is so connected to Sudan in a sense that the refugees who are fleeing Darfur are entering Chad. The same communities live on the both sides of the border. We had a coup in Chad, which triggered this pivot to Russia by the new military junta. The main concern is that Chad provides this security firewall. If you're traveling from West Africa or the Sahel coming to East Africa through the desert, Chad used to be traditionally the country that was leading counterterrorism efforts. If the conflict in Sudan gets out of hand and sucks in Chad and instability is registered in Chad, it means that firewall is gone. It allows the jihadists who are present and active in all the region from the Sahel near Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, free reign to travel across if they wanted to connect with the jihadists in East Africa, including Al-Shabaab in Somalia. It also means criminal gangs across the desert in Sahara and the Sahel could also exploit this situation if there was state failure in Sudan. Number one, to traffic weapons like gun running, and also to facilitate the illegal trade in moving people, migrants, through to Europe through the Mediterranean.
The day before I met Amel in Nairobi, she told me she applied for refugee status. It felt like an expression of her fears for the future of her country.
We have to stop the hate speech because it became very loud and loud. And if the people start to kill each other because of the color of skin, because of which tribe you belong to, this will be like the end of Sudan like we know it.
There's no deficit of gloomy prospects, but occasionally our experts see a glimmer of hope.
There was a tweet by one of the very vocal activists on X, and they were talking about the Africa Cup of Nations and the fact that it's being hosted by Cote d'Ivoire, and Cote d'Ivoire had been through its own civil war. And she said something like, there might still be hope for Sudan. I think voices like that probably need to be heard more.
If you've not followed AFCON, Ivory Coast did win the tournament against the odds. Thank you to all our contributors, Beverly Ochieng, Sumaya Baksh, Deka Barrow, Moses Rono, Ahmed Mohamed Abdi, and Amel Al-Hassan. The producer is Krista Shaturi, technical production by Elchin Suleimanov, mixing by Nick Scripps, our editor is Judy King, and I'm Krasi Twig. Thank you for giving us your time.